viewers, and welcome to the 23rd lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous lecture, I introduced a particular poetic form, the sonnet, and I described how, in the hands of a skilled sonneteer such as Edna and Vincent Millay, the sonnet allows for remarkable capacity of expression. It allows for a courageous and daring degree of spiritual as well as emotional inquiry. And I promised that I would continue our discussion of Edna St. Vincent Millay by close reading and commenting on other works. I will do that, but before I continue reading and describing other poems by this very prolific poet, I want to comment briefly on another very important context that is necessary for us to understand and appreciate the work of this poet. And that context is the American literary and popular magazine Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair borrowed its name from the Victorian novel by William Makepeace Thackeray and has today gained the reputation of something that crosses between a popular tabloid as well as something that has a great deal of cultural and almost literary value. In the time that Edna St. Vincent Millay was active, this magazine was also seen in that way. It published many literary pieces, but it also occupied the realm of fashion. It also occupied the realm of activities that were deemed popular and in fashion, in society. So the fact that Edna St. Vincent Millay published many of her poems first in this magazine is important. It is even more important because some of her most well-loved sonnets which today are associated so deeply with the name of Edna St. Vincent Millay as to almost define her. Those sonnets also were first published in Vanity Fair. So it's important to understand what this context meant and how Millay challenged as well as reinforced some of the expectations that this magazine brought to her image. So there were some stereotypes that were in circulation and which the magazine helped put in place. There was the stereotype of the smart woman. This person, the smart woman, was a sociable person who had a lot of connections, was educated, was very sophisticated, that is not just knowledgeable in books, but also knowledgeable in the ways of the world, right? The cultural traditions, the unwritten rules of social intercourse. This person was also very well versed in culture, not just classical culture, such as the paintings or the art or sculpture of ancient Greece and Rome. Not just that, although that too, but in addition to that, the culture which goes by the name of fashion. And this person was also very well acquainted with what were the good places in terms of restaurants or social gatherings in the city. So this was a stereotype that was in circulation, the smart woman. There was an expectation that such a woman's description of her relationships and personal troubles would be entertaining to readers of serious intellectual or literary content. The idea was that by reading about the activities of these smart women, male or predominantly male, serious-minded intellectual readers would derive some amount of joy by having feminine folly exposed to ridicule. So as you can see, there was a deeply misogynist logic to the manner in which the smart woman stereotype was popularized and exploited by magazines such as Vanity Fair. Now, as a writer who needed the publicity, as a writer who could use the platform, could use the opportunity to project her voice and the opportunity to be read by hundreds, if not thousands, of readers, Millay's position was a complicated one. On one hand, Millay was grateful to the position that Vanity Fair gave her. On the other hand, Millay did not agree with many of the stereotypes and definitely not this deeply misogynist stereotype. So Millay's response can be read through the kind of writing she published in this magazine. And we can see that on one hand, Millay reinforces that stereotype, but on the other hand, Millay also challenges that stereotype. On one hand, Millay gives readers of Vanity Fair exactly what they expect from their stereotypical image of this smart woman of society. That is, in her writings, Millay provides many racy and some gossipy details of the lives of real and fictional smart women in society. On the other hand, Millay also challenges some of these stereotypes by providing a deeply thought out, intellectual, serious, philosophical, and almost masculine, because that was the code. The code was that masculine concerns were intellectual and serious, whereas feminine concerns were all about fashion and flippant and casual. So Millay's writing combined these two, juxtaposed these two, defined that one could be both. One could be feminine in the code which associated femininity with fashion, but also at the same time, while being that, one could also be deeply intellectual and smart and think through and examine very sharply the choices one was making. Further, the response that Millay's writing takes towards these stereotypes is that it challenges them by owning them, by embracing them. In this context, we can see that these magazines, and especially Vanity Fair, established smartness as a binary opposition to sentimentality. So while Vanity Fair touted smartness, it was an implicit and sometimes explicit challenge and rejection of the other kind of quality which some other magazines and other writers associated with femininity, and that was sentimentality. What was sentimentality, and why was Vanity Fair responding so strongly and challenging sentimentality? Sentimentality was a feature or a characteristic that was found in several 19th century writings, and especially many 19th century literary magazines which continued to be popular in the 20th century. These featured women writers and protagonists who lamented many romantic losses. And even if they weren't exactly lamenting romantic losses, they seemed to be troubled by unresolved emotional conflicts. This explains the word sentimentality. So the figure of the woman which emerged from the pages of these journals and magazines was that of a sentimental type of person, someone who fell victim too easily to emotions, someone who seemed to be a slave to her emotions. And this made the person look weak, less intellectual, less impressive in a world where independence and agency were valued. So instead of being able to control one's emotions, these were people who, it appeared, were being controlled by their emotions. This was the figure that the editors of a magazine like Vanity Fair wanted to challenge, and the writing of Edna St. Vincent Millay proved to be very good ammunition for this campaign. As we will see, Edna St. Vincent Millay challenged this reputation because the protagonists and the speakers of Millay's poems are very frequently in control of their intellectual journeys. But this is not always the case. And uh, almost as many times one can see that these speakers and protagonists are controlled by their emotions, but sometimes they find the intellectual resources to overturn the table and to get some control back. So it is a challenge, but it is not as straightforward a challenge as one might expect. So the relationship between Vanity Fair, the kind of feminist campaign and the kind of feminist reinterpretation of the sentimental woman that this magazine wanted to undertake, that campaign existed in an uneasy relationship with the writings and the personality of Edna St. Vincent Millay. Millay also wrote several pieces under a pseudonym that was Nancy Boyd. The pieces that Millay wrote as Nancy Boyd were not poems, were not sonnets. They were mostly prose pieces, some satirical and some fictional, but they represented things that in the popular imagination were associated with femininity. Things like clothes or makeup or relationships. And the tone that Millay took in these pieces as Nancy Boyd was always satirical. It was never a straightforward acceptance that these were feminine things. In fact, the attitude was always bordering between a naive and innocent acceptance and an ironic challenge, as if these things were too insignificant for the person to be concerned about them. A word about Nancy Boyd. Nancy Boyd was in fact the name of Millay's grandmother. So you can see that there is a clear linkage between the writer and the biological lineage from which the writer emerges. Right? By using the name of her grandmother as a pseudonym for writing pieces which could play a role in shaping the perception of women, right? Millay was making a conscious feminist choice. The word Nancy Boyd also signals two cognate phrases. On one hand, it is very close to Nancy Boy, right? And the phrase Nancy Boy signifies an effeminate or somewhat not normal or something a little bit different from the typical or stereotypical man. So that's one, Nancy Boy. The other term that Nancy Boyd also connects to is body. Body is an anagram of Boyd, and both of these phrases and words signal how the performance and the critique of stereotypes was a very deep part of what Millay was doing by writing and publishing these pieces in the magazine Vanity Fair. The magazine introduced the writer Nancy Boyd in a November 1921 issue with these words. The writer was supposedly a blonde writer, a woman obviously, a blonde woman writer, sitting on an oversized couch in oversized pajamas, hunched over a notebook with a pen, and being surveyed by a cat. Now, you can see, if you look at each of these features, how they reinforce many of the stereotypes associated with both femininity as well as how writing emerges from a woman's life. Right? The perspective is also that of a masculine reader and viewer. Right? There's a stereotype that women writers are lonely or they have pets, especially cats, and there is something about the solitude of women writers which is seen in a derogative manner from the perspective of a suspecting male reader. Right? This image also seeks to render frivolous, moody, and indulgent what is actually the intellectual labor and the cognitive labor of writing. The impression one gets from an image like this is that women's writing is subject to the whims and caprices of individuals who may or may not end up producing something of lasting intellectual value. Nonetheless, having given this kind of an introduction, the pieces that were published under the name of Nancy Boyd challenged many of these stereotypes. Now, we will see some of these stereotypes and how Millay juxtaposes feminine caprices or wiles or moodiness with masculine seriousness, intellectual and philosophical value in some poems which I will read shortly. Before I go to these poems, which were published in Vanity Fair and in book form found their way to the publication for which Millay won the Pulitzer Prize, that is Harp Fever. Before I do that, I want to reflect on a couple of sonnets from the first collection of Millay, that is Renaissance. In the remainder of my discussion, I will provide a roughly speaking, chronological overview of Millay's work and describe how from the beginning to roughly the second half of Millay's career, the intellectual concerns of her poetry provide a very interesting and powerful shape. So we will begin by looking at a sonnet from the first collection, Renaissance and Other Poems. This is the second sonnet, and this is how it goes. Millay writes, "Time does not bring relief, you all have lied. Who told me time would ease me of my pain? I miss him in the weeping of the rain. I want him at the shrinking of the tide. The old snows melt from every mountain side, and last year's leaves are smoke in every lane. But last year's bitter loving must remain, heaped on my heart, and my old thoughts abide. There are 100 places where I fear to go, so with his memory they brim. And entering with relief some quiet place, where never fell his foot or shone his face, I say, there is no memory of him here. And so stand stricken, so remembering him." Those of you who've paid attention, you can easily tell what kind of a sonnet this is. This continues the tradition that we began, and I mentioned in the previous lecture that as a sonneteer, Millay leans towards the Petrarchan more than she does towards the Shakespearean, and this, from her early connection, Renaissance, is an example of a traditional, more conventional type of sonnet. If we look at the chronology, we know that the Petrarchan is quite literally older than the Shakespearean, and so we find Millay, like several other woman poets from the 19th and 20th century, using the conventionality of the Petrarchan sonnet as opposed to the Shakespearean form. Here as well, the 14 lines are split into two sets of 8 and 6, and in the 9th line we can see that there is a shift in the tone, that the proposition or the problem which was stated in the beginning is restated from a different perspective. Let us try and briefly summarize the problem. The problem seems to have a few components. The first is that there is a great deal of consternation. Time does not bring relief, you all have lied. Who told me time would ease me of my pain? So the poet is accusing everyone around her of making a false promise, giving her false hope. Time does not bring relief. So something has happened from which the poet needs relief, and she was told that the passage of time would be enough to bring relief, and that has not happened. So this is one part of the problem. Uh, Further, we learn what that problem or what is that event from which the poet needs relief. And it seems that it has to do with the departure or the loss of a person. This person is identified simply with the pronoun him. Uh, we are told that the poet misses him when it rains. We are told that the poet wants him when the tide shrinks, and so on, when snows melt, when leaves are smoke, etc. When nature changes, when nature reflects the passage of time, the poet is reminded of the absence of this person from her life. So, this is the second part of the problem. Time fails to provide relief. The absence of a person who was once a part of the poet's life, that remains. It is not addressed in any way. That gap remains unfilled. And then something else. There's a third part of this problem. The person is missing, but something remains. Last year's bitter loving must remain, heaped on my heart, and all thoughts abide. So once the three parts of this problem are established, we witness a slight change in tone. We witness a turn in the progression of the ideas. The poet tells us that there are 100 places where I fear to go, so with his memory they brim. It is the fact that places brim with the memory of this person. So the places where the poet had once traveled with this person seem to be imbued or seem to carry the memory. The poet has been looking for places where there is no association with this person. So the poet says that she seems to enter with quiet relief some place where never fell his foot or shone his face, right? And this is a beginning of the solution to the problem, that it is possible for the poet to find certain places that bear no association. The problem seems to be that everything they have done together while they were together seems to have received an unspoken, some sort of magical spiritual connection to this person. If only the poet could find a place where this person is not associated in any way, that might be a solution to her problem. So the poet says, I say there is no memory of him here, and so stands stricken, so remembering him. This, however, also does not prove to be a foolproof solution, because even if a place does not carry an overt association with this person, it is the poet's mind, it is the poet's memory which projects an association and creates the association in places where there was none to begin with. So, by the time the sonnet ends, the poet has established two different sources from which the problem can be made worse or resolved. The first source is that wherever they go, the places and the things and the objects around them carry traces of past experiences. This is one. On the other hand, it is not so much the objects and the places which in themselves carry the association of the poet's past, but it is the poet's memory which projects that past onto those objects and thereby makes them so pregnant with meaning and nostalgia. By the time the poem ends, the poet is reaching a position of understanding exactly how and why grief is experienced and exactly how to manage that experience of grief. The turn in the progression of ideas is less clear in this sonnet, I will admit, than it is in some others. But nonetheless, it is important to note that this was an early moment in the development of the career of this poet. And so one can see how the skill and the proficiency that this writer has with this very old and one of the strictest and most lasting forms might not have developed to its fullest. The poet would achieve the peak of her skill with the sonnet a little bit later. I will begin by briefly introducing the first poem from the second collection of poems in a book form that Millay published. This is 2nd April. The collection 2nd April begins with the poem Spring. I will quickly read this poem and wrap up this lecture and continue with a deeper commentary and understanding of this poem in the subsequent lecture, which will also be the concluding lecture on the work of Millay. This is how Millay begins 2nd April, the poem Spring. To what purpose, April, do you return again? Beauty is not enough. You can no longer quiet me with the redness of little leaves opening stickily. I know what I know. The sun is hot on my neck as I observe the spikes of the crocus. The smell of the earth is good. It is apparent that there is no death. But what does that signify? Not only underground are the brains of men eaten by maggots. Life in itself is nothing. An empty cup, a flight of uncarpeted stairs. It is not enough that yearly down this hill, April comes like an idiot, babbling and strewing flowers. At this point, we can simply note the power, the authority, and the unambiguous sense of finality and mortality which radiates from the tone of this poem. The speaker is observing very sharply, very astutely, the changes in the natural surroundings that happen during the month of April. Now, we must remember that this is not April in any part of the world, because April is experienced differently on different parts of the planet, Earth. But this is April as it was in the New England, in the northeastern state of Maine in the US. April is a time when the snows and the ice and the hard-packed, frozen conditions of winter begin to thaw, and nature or life begins to push its way out from the melting snow. So April is associated as a time when life makes its presence felt. The poet is observing the signs of life breaking through, and yet the poet is constantly thinking of death. This is what the tone of this poem conveys. We will understand exactly how each word in this poem is designed to convey the deeper emotional and intellectual causes of this sort of morbidity, cynicism, or anger. We will continue this poem in the next lecture. Thank you.